Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed teachers, and my fellow students. When we hear the phrase, Greek mythology, most of us imagine stories of powerful gods, dramatic heroes, and epic adventures. We think of Zeus, the almighty ruler of Olympus, of Hercules completing his 12 labors, or of Odysseus sailing across stormy seas in the Odyssey. The very idea of Greek mythology often brings to mind excitement, power, romance, betrayal, and incredible imagination. But there is another side to this world of myths, a side that people rarely talk about, and that is the idea of myths that might be considered boring, dull, or even sleep-inducing. This may sound unusual, because how can myths filled with gods and monsters ever be boring? Yet, if you dig deeper, you realize that not all stories were created equal. Some of them don't thrill us, don't spark our imaginations, and instead put us into a kind of mythological sleep. And so today, I want to reflect on what we might call the boring Greek myths, or as I like to phrase it, the sleep mythology of ancient Greece. When we analyze mythology, it is important to remember that it served many different purposes in ancient societies. Some myths were created to entertain, to inspire wonder, or to explain strange natural phenomena. Others were intended to instill moral lessons or to explain the origin of rituals and traditions. But not every myth had the flair of a heroic tale or the intensity of a tragic love story. Some myths were highly repetitive, overly detailed about minor gods, or filled with lists of genealogies that would challenge even the most patient reader. Imagine sitting through an oral recital of who begat whom, tracing every minor river god and every obscure nymph in long, unbroken passages. For many listeners, this might have been fascinating if they lived in that culture and needed to memorize their traditions, but for us today, it can feel like little more than a lullaby. Take, for example, the myths that deal with agricultural cycles and harvest rituals. These were important to ancient Greeks because they lived in a society heavily dependent on farming. They needed explanations for the changing of seasons and reassurance that the earth would yield crops each year. One of the better-known myths in this category is the story of Demeter and Persephone, which at least has some drama, with Persephone being abducted by Hades. But for every dramatic moment in that myth, there are also extended passages about agricultural rituals, sacred ceremonies, and temple practices that, if read today, can feel more like an old instruction manual than a gripping story. This is what I mean by sleep mythology, the kind of storytelling that once had a sacred function but today may not capture our imagination in the same way. Another aspect of boring Greek myths is their overwhelming focus on genealogies. Many texts, such as Hesiod's Theogony, are packed with endless lists of gods, titans, primordial beings, and all their descendants. While the first few lines may excite you, Chaos, Gaia, Uranus, the great titans, you quickly find yourself in a sea of names. Nereus fathered this many daughters, each one given a name, this god married that goddess, and from their union came a long list of offspring. For the ancient Greeks, who needed to preserve oral traditions and establish cultural identity, this was meaningful. It was like a cosmic family tree that explained how everything was connected. But for modern audiences, especially students who are first encountering Greek mythology, it can feel exhausting. There are so many minor deities that one can hardly keep track, and soon enough, our minds drift off. It is not because these myths are unimportant, but because their style of delivery is repetitive, monotonous, and without the exciting conflict or resolution we usually associate with mythology. Then there are myths that are almost too simple, too short, or too uneventful to hold attention. Many myths about constellations, for example, are just a few lines long. A hunter offended a goddess, and she turned him into a star. A maiden rejected a suitor, and the gods placed her in the sky. These stories serve as quick explanations for why stars or constellations exist, but they lack depth, drama, or memorable characters. They are functional myths, not entertaining ones. Imagine listening to dozens of these short explanations in a row. It would feel like a lecture on astronomy disguised as mythology. This again shows us that not all myths were designed to entertain. Some were simply practical, and practicality, when retold in a modern classroom, can easily become boring. Furthermore, myths about obscure local heroes often feel irrelevant to wider audiences. Greece was not a unified nation in ancient times but a collection of city-states, each with its own traditions and legends. Local communities often had their own myths about small-time kings, founders, or warriors who performed acts of bravery that never gained fame beyond their city walls. For the local people, these stories were important for civic pride. But for us today, They can feel unremarkable compared to the grandeur of Hercules or the tragedy of Oedipus. Listening to story after story about minor characters who fought in local wars or built a small shrine may lull modern listeners into boredom, creating a sense of mythological fatigue. But what is truly interesting is how boredom itself plays a role in mythology. What seems boring to us may not have been boring to the people who first told these stories. Their entire lives were shaped by agriculture, community rituals, and religious practices. For them, listening to myths about crops, seasons, or minor gods was a way to connect with their environment and to make sense of the natural world. What we dismiss as sleep mythology might have been sacred knowledge to them. It reminds us that the concept of boring or exciting is often a matter of perspective. A story that puts us to sleep might have once kept a whole community spiritually awake. Still, when teaching or discussing Greek mythology today, we cannot ignore the fact that students often find certain myths tedious. This gives rise to the question, should we only focus on the dramatic myths, the exciting ones, and leave out the rest? My answer is no. Even the boring myths have value, because they help us see the full picture of ancient life. They teach us that mythology was not only about entertainment but also about function. They remind us that myths were not just stories but cultural tools, connecting people to their land, their ancestors, and their gods. Yes, they may be sleep-inducing for us now, but they hold the echoes of real people's fears, hopes, and beliefs. So perhaps we should not mock these myths for being boring but instead respect them for their purpose. The so-called boring myths are like the quiet background music in the grand orchestra of Greek mythology. They are not the thrilling solos, but they are still part of the symphony. And if we pay attention, even sleep mythology can reveal truths about human life, about the ways we seek to explain the unexplainable, and about the ways people before us tried to make sense of the world. In the end, whether a myth excites us or bores us, it serves as a reminder that storytelling is universal. Every culture has its epics and its dull rituals, its heroes and its forgotten names. Greek mythology, with all its dazzling gods and its sleep-inducing genealogies, reflects the full spectrum of human experience. So the next time you encounter a myth that feels boring, remember, you are not just listening to a dull story, you are stepping into the minds of people who lived thousands of years ago, people who found meaning in those very tales. And perhaps, if we look closer, even the myths that make us yawn can awaken something in us, a deeper understanding of history, of humanity, and of the timeless power of stories.